Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. I am delighted to be opening this really timely conversation today, organized in partnership with our colleagues at the Africa Center and the Eurasia Center on understanding Russia's role in the Sahel. This is indeed very timely, not only because we are talking about Russia a lot in the news right now in another region, of course, in the conflict with Ukraine, but we are in the context leading to the EU African Union summit set to take place this week on February 17th and 18th in Brussels, but also at a time where France and its European partners are debating and discussing France's continued role in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. This is a really good moment for our centers to partner on this conversation and discuss the future of US and European involvement in the region in the backdrop of Russia's increasing, but maybe not so new role in the region. Of course, we'll be talking a lot about the role that the Wagner mercenaries have played in places like Central Africa and now today Mali. We'll talk about how could Western strategies and intervention coexist in a place like Mali alongside Russia, and what does Russia want to achieve in this region? We've brought together today a great group of the best experts on this question to discuss. And with that, I would like to invite my terrific colleagues, Ambassador Rama Yad, who's the Senior Director of the Africa Center, and Cameron Hudson, the Africa Center Senior Fellow, who have helped lead our engagement on the region, and to welcome our guest and lead this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm happy to welcome you too in this very timely event, like Ben just stressed. I'd like to contextualize the moment we are living, and maybe by starting with a brief history of Russia-Africa relations, because we cannot understand what's going on now if we don't have a quick look on the past. Don't worry, we will not go back to the Middle Ages. However, those Russian-African relations date from the Russian Orthodox pilgrims when they met with Egyptians and Ethiopians in the Holy Land, while Russian and African Muslims met in the sacred sites of Islam. Russian explorers already visited the current DRC, Egypt, South Africa, and you know everything about the famous Russian poet Pushkin, whose ancestor was a Russian aristocrat after being an African slave. But from the end of the 18th century, the Tsars developed diplomatic ties with Africa, already with consulates opened in Egypt, Ethiopia, in Morocco. Do remember the October Revolution of 1917, with several Africans coming to Moscow for political formations, and of course the Cold War, the big peace with the support of the Soviet Union to national liberation movements on the continent, such as the African National Congress in South Africa. The USSR deployed more than 40,000 advisors in more than 40 African countries. About 40 technical and economic assistance agreements have been signed too. 25,000 African students are also welcomed in the Soviet Union, including the Patrice Lumumba University. So, but this activism will not necessarily be conclusive. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Russian influence on the African continent. President Yeltsin even stopped all foreign aid to Africa. It will take like nearly 20 years for the Russians to return to the continent with contracts, the travels organized by Putin, Medvedev in Morocco, Angola, Namibia, Nigeria, with hundreds of businessmen. A position of advisor for Africa has been created in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The last move was, of course, Sochi. The huge meeting between Russia and 43 African heads of states, with this priority to double the trade in 5 years, by promising debt cancellation, and above all focus most of this policy to weapons. After 20 years far from Africa, Russia did not seem to have a real African policy, though, but Africa is more and more a strategic continent. And today, we are talking about its role in the Sahel, through the role of Wagner and beyond Russia, which triggers a lot of questions and a need to understanding Russia's role in Africa, and especially in the Sahel. That is what we are going to discuss about today. Cameron Hudson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rama, and great to see everybody. I'm quickly just going to introduce our 5 discussants today, and then jump right into questions, since we have a lot of ground to cover. So first, Andrew Leibowitz is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. His research there focuses on North Africa and the Sahel. He is currently a doctoral candidate in African history at Columbia University, where he studies religion, politics, and society in North Africa, the Sahel, and the Sahara generally. Previously worked at the Open Society Initiative in West Africa as a Sahel consultant there. Bakary Sambe is the regional director of the Timbuktu Institute for the African Center for Peace and Studies. He's the founder of the Observatory of Religious Radicalism and Conflict in Africa, and is an assistant professor at Gaston Berger University in Senegal. Katrina Doxey is an associate director and associate fellow for the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. And prior to joining CSIS, she worked as an associate policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Dr. Michael Shurkin is director of global programs at 14 North Strategies, and previously served as a CIA political analyst and as a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, focusing, among other things, on the Sahel. And then our very own Sean McFate is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, and is also a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Syracuse University's Maxwell School, as long as with the National Defense University. He's an advisor to Oxford University's Center for Technology and Global Affairs, and is an expert on mercenaries, and as a regular consultant to many US government agencies. So with that, and with this excellent panel, I want to jump right into the questions. And first ask Katrina if you would help lead us off, given this very important and wide-ranging conversation that we can have. I want you to just sort of give us the laydown of what has happened in the last few months with the introduction of the Wagner Group into Mali. How should we be thinking about this latest intervention inside the country, given the context of the unfolding security situation there? How should we be looking at and interpreting what is happening? And frankly, just giving us a laydown as what are the basic facts around this new involvement?
Absolutely. So thank you, Cameron, and thank you to everyone on the team for having me here today. So the Russian Wagner Group's intervention in Mali is actually the latest in a series of interventions in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. That is part of a broader strategy that Russia is using private military companies, which are linked to the Russian government and to the military, to intelligence services, through obscured ways, often through oligarchs such as Yevgeny Prigozhin, and can operate in different environments as a deniable force and a tool of irregular warfare to be able to spread Russian influence and to achieve geopolitical, economic, and military goals without being directly linked overtly to the Kremlin and without being regular forces. So we've already seen worldwide an increase since 2015 from about 5 deployments of Russian PMCs in 2015 to 27 countries in 2021 that have a demonstrated presence of Russian PMCs. 16 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa, where we really see this PMC model evolving to be able to achieve Russia's goals, particularly in states with rich natural resources and weak governance and often facing security challenges. So, of course, the latest of these is Mali, where in September 2021, we began to hear reports that the military junta was in conversation with the Wagner group to potentially deploy an unclear number. Some estimates put it as high as 1,000 Wagner troops to the country to assist both with military training and operations against insurgent groups, but also to provide direct security to political leaders. There's been quite a bit of discussion of this being sort of also a way for the junta to secure their own position and power and to what's referred to as coup-proofing the regime to ensure that they're able to stay in place and to prevent any resistance, prevent any real push of the transition government timeline. So these reports began to come out in September. They were widely denied despite growing evidence. And we began to see the first deployments of Wagner Group mercenaries to Bamako in December of 2021, roughly around the 19th, 20th. And so at CSIS, we've studied satellite imagery that actually shows that between September and December of 2021, when this first came to light, there was an operating base that has been constructed adjacent to the international airport in Bamako and just southwest of the Malian Air Force 101 base. And so we've seen this sort of be built up. They've cleared an area that had previously been vegetation, built a new access road, different security entrances and security revetments around the sides of it. They've built up a series of buildings to be used as barracks. They're in the process of constructing a headquarters at the center. And this is where a lot of these troops began to locate as they were deployed in December of 2021. There have also been reports of Wagner troops continuing to spread throughout the country, including into central Mali, where the security environment is the most contested with JNIM militants as well as other local militias. And Wagner suffered its first casualties on January 5th. There have also been reports as Wagner troops continue to spread throughout the country that they have also taken up residence at former Barkhane bases, including in Timbuktu. And so as we've seen this establishment continue, of course, there's also the ongoing political question of France's involvement and other Western countries' involvement, as opposed to this Russian intervention, which has come in and really displaced their positioning here. And the question moves forward then to discuss today what will happen, particularly with the news that France and others will be withdrawing. And I would just note one final thing, that in those initial reports, it was reportedly in discussion to have up to 1,000 Wagner troops deployed to Mali. As of the statements yesterday from France, we're hearing reports that there are already estimated to be about 1,000 Wagner troops in the country. And so it will also be interesting to watch if that number continues to grow past those initial estimates that we heard back in September.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katrina. It was very, very helpful to listen to your first comments around this Wagner group. 1,000, that's the number you said, confirming the French assessment. I just a quick word for our viewers and listeners. You have written this piece tracking the arrival of Russia's Wagner group in Mali early February with your colleagues Joseph Bermudez and Jared Thompson. Very, very interesting. And I would like to dig deeper here with our senior fellow at the center, Sean McFay. Sean, when we listen to Katrina, we have a question: why mercenaries and why not Russian soldiers from the Russian army, like we see at the borders of Ukraine, for example? Why does Russia even deny having links with this private military group? And are the Wagner's activities in Mali similar to its deployment in Central African Republic or in Libya? What's your view around the role of private military companies in Africa?
Well, sure. So first of all, let's just focus on Wagner Group. And let's call them mercenaries, because that's really what they are. And Russia has launched expeditionary military operations into two continents, the Middle East and Africa, for the first time since the 1980s. And their weapon of choice are mercenaries, especially the Wagner Group, but there are other Russian mercenaries too. And the Wagner Group, works really for the Kremlin. But the reason why they're attractive to Russia is because of two reasons. One is that we live in an information age, and in an information age, weapons that give you plausible deniability are far more important than lethality, lethal firepower. And nothing gives you better plausible deniability than mercenaries. I mean, remember last summer when Colombian mercenaries killed the president of Haiti, assassinated the president of Haiti? We captured those mercenaries, but we still don't know who they work for, and they still don't know who they work for. Now, we know who Wagner works for, but they still offer enough plausible deniability that if things go really badly, then Russia can say, well, they went rogue, they really weren't us, we'll disavow them. Now, if you have a Russian Spetsnaz soldier or an FSB, intelligence officer, they're much more difficult to disavow. And because you can disavow them, and Russia doesn't really care about what our intelligence communities think. They're trying to think about, CNN and Fox and stuff like that. As long as you have some ability to disavow them, you can take bigger risks. So it lowers the barriers of entry into conflict, and things that turn upside down, as it happened in Central African Republic with the Wagner Group, as happened in North Mozambique and parts of Libya, or Eastern Syria, when they actually went up against American special forces and got beaten. The reason they did not explode more diplomatically is because all sides could walk away from it, right? So Wagner Group and mercenaries are becoming a tool and weapon of choice for modern sneaky wars. The other thing that they give Putin is that Russia is a very casualty averse society. They hate seeing Russian soldiers coming home in body bags, but they don't care about Russian contractors, many of whom are ex-Russian soldiers. So, for political domestic, politics in Russia, Putin can be a lot more aggressive and doesn't have to worry about a domestic backlash about, soldiers coming home in body bags. So that's why we're seeing Russia using the Wagner Group all over Africa, from Madagascar, all the sort of a spine, all the way up to Libya, and now Mali. They're being paid about $10 million a month is the report. And this allows Russia to get its claws in the Sahel and helps Russia's national security strategy of trying to become a superpower again. And they're using the vacuum created by the withdrawal of the French soldiers and the domestic issues in Mali to seize this opportunity.
I'm going to jump in. Thank you, Sean, for that helpful laydown. I want to turn to Bakary because he's in the region, and I think we want to try to bring in a regional perspective to this conversation, and get a better sense. One thing we haven't talked about yet is the kind of disinformation that's been, I think, rampant in this conflict and in other conflicts on the continent right now. And I'm just curious, Bakary, first, how are Malians themselves viewing this deployment? And then also, how do you assess the kind of the information environment around this deployment? How are people, I mean, we've seen reports of even the French military using Facebook to try to, or associated groups with the French military trying to use Facebook to burnish France's role here and to criticize Russian involvement. We've seen Russia employing similar tactics here and across the region. How are Malians viewing this sort of battle for hearts and minds of the Malians, and how are they viewing this newest deployment and this entry of Russia into the space?
Thank you very much. I thank you to invite me to take part in this very interesting discussion with some colleagues. I know some of them, and it's a pleasure for me to exchange with you. I often say that in the Sahelian crisis, there is a kind of conflict of perception between the international conception and the local perception. The local population do not really understand everything that is happening today. While there is a foreign military presence and forces everywhere, the population near the borders feel that they are not only suffering the consequences of the draconian security measure taken by the government, but also feel that they are living in insecurity. This is reflected in the spontaneous and organized demonstration that take place in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, for example, where the episode of the blocking of the Barkhane logistics convoy on everyone's mind. Moreover, contrary to what one might think, the Sahel has never been an easy subject for France. It must constantly manage the emergency and the history in the meantime. This is the problem. And now with it, how has Russia been able, for the time being, to win the battle of communication in this war of positioning and influence in the region that is not its preferred zone, for example? I think that the first point is, while European countries like France have long persisted in a diplomacy of representation in close relation with the elite, they have not taken into account the dynamics of Sahelian civil society that have benefited from the expansion of social network and digital communication. It's first. The other thing, the second point is that France has lost contact with the real society, and especially with young people for whom protest is the most important political issue. And Russia, in this case, plays on history, especially since it has not had any colonial relationship with Africa. In the meantime, Russia exploits the frustration of young African generation, to whom French migration policies have deprived of the same connection that previous generation had with Paris and its intellectual universe. Finally, Russia exploits the effect of the colonial relationship of domination, even appropriating the notion of South-South cooperation like China. There was the decisive summit of Sochi, about which Rama had talked in the beginning, which involved African civil society and activists. And Russia take advantage of the failure of security cooperation by promoting conspiracy theories. Today, there are also vast disinformation operations that attempt to discredit French policy in the Sahel, and at the same time that the effect of presidential campaign in this country, France, make the communication of the French elite more vulnerable. So we are now in the Sahel in a new asymmetric war of influence, and the issue is how will the democracy's combat strategy of a new partner of the Sahelian countries that does not care about ethics and principle. So the issue of disinformation is very important, and they use social networks like Facebook. For example, in Timbuktu Institute, we are working on about Sahelian Observatory of Social Networks, and we have access of to CrowdTriangle, which analyze the way of using Facebook with by Russia and some pages created by some people belonging to Russia and who are trying to do this very important propaganda in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bakary. Your comments are really useful to understand more about the communication strategy in Russia and how the people on the ground react. I'd like now to give the floor to Michael Shokin to ask about some points already stressed by Bakary, but maybe we can strengthen here the thoughts. In 10 years, how Michael, do you appreciate the French, the European, or even Western military intervention in the Sahel? What went wrong? What went well? How do you explain Barkhane's withdrawal from the region? And do you think in how the French should remain involved in the war against terrorism?
Thank you very much for having me. To talk about what went wrong over the last 10 years and what went well, I would really need another 5 hours to get into that. I think that as it relates to Russia, I think there's an issue here about the importance of public opinion and also the importance of the relationships between France and the countries that are its partners. I think it's very clear that France didn't either understand or appreciate or neglected its relationship with the Sahelian publics and also with the governments. And it really kind of created this space that the Russians have been able to very deftly exploit. That's also something that people need to understand, that while it's important to appreciate the effect or the impact of Russian operations, Russian efforts, they were able to exploit vulnerabilities and problems that are ultimately on France's shoulders and not them. So we must not scapegoat Russia or say that this is all because of Russia. But so France has made a number of missteps. French policy has a number of flaws that we can discuss and debate. But I think that the Russian equation definitely speaks to this sort of gap between this growing gap between public opinion, meaning what the French have been doing, their failure to sort of engage in public opinion, to attend to it, to try to create narratives, to explain what they're doing, and to sort of to make understood what they're up to. Because in that gap of misunderstanding or lack of understanding, I think that a lot of people have let their imaginations go wild. And the Russians have been really good at getting in and basically providing answers and helping shape an ideology that Sahelians have been using to sort of understand why things are going so badly in their country, and ultimately to justify, frankly, the current power structures that exist within Mali, basically by putting responsibility onto the French. In terms of whether or not French should stay and keep maintaining counterterrorism activities, I'd like to say yes, but it's important that France try to reflect on the problems it's had with its policies and the problems it's had with relationship with Mali and the Malian public, and hopefully learn from them. Because if it just kind of continues making the same mistakes, then I feel like this might be a real problem. But there's an opportunity now to, I think, to try to, well, it might be too late to start fresh, but there's an opportunity to do so if France is capable of learning. But then also there's really no doubt that the situation is going to get worse in the whole region slowly but surely. And so France, and I think the rest of us, have an interest to figure out ways to help. So I would never advocate walking away, but I do advocate sort of thinking strongly about, well, how to make things different, how to do things differently and smarter.
Thanks, Mike. I want to bring in Andrew, who's our last but not least speaker here, and sort of pick up on a few things that you just said, and kind of go beyond. I mean, I think we've been talking, or the sort of the mainstream press on this has been talking about Russia's involvement as if it is a blow, a defeat to kind of Western interests in the country. But there's another narrative out there, which is that, sort of Russia is inheriting this quagmire that European states haven't been able to really make a lot of progress in terms of either rolling back ultimately the threats of terrorism from these countries, but also stabilizing the countries. And so if you have a withdrawal of European and kind of Western interests from the country, how should we be viewing the prospects for any kind of Russian involvement on the ground? Are they going to be able to do any better than what we have seen from Western interventions up to this point? And are they just inheriting a headache that Western nations are sort of happy to pass off at this point?
Very well. Thank you for having me and for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I think it's a very good question, a very interesting question, particularly because Russia really hasn't engaged in the kind of broad-based stabilization operations that France, the EU, the international community have undertaken. And so not only also does this potentially engender the departure of French forces of, say, French aligned forces under task force Takuba, but also the withdrawal of those forces is going to cause some serious potential issues for the UN peacekeeping operation in Mali for MINUSMA. And so I do think that one of the questions that people have been asking really for several months now is basically the junta, the transitional government in Mali, is there a real strategy here, or is this a series of short-term decisions or short-term thinking underway? And I think it really tends to be the latter here, because I don't think Russia is going to replace the entire suite of programs of development cooperation, of training programs that exist in Mali right now. Now we can have a separate discussion about how effective those have been, and that's maybe not quite the subject for right now. But certainly Russia is not going to try to replace all of those programs, and we've heard even some voices in Mali, particularly because there has been a bit of a disconnect between the parts of Mali where French international forces are active and the parts where they're not, in terms of the perception of these forces and their necessity. And so I do think there's a lot of concern, particularly in parts of northern Mali, about what will happen when these forces withdraw, what will happen not just in terms of international forces and the pressure on jihadist groups, but also what might happen to the UN mission that's very important for security, but also for some economic development in the region. And then in central Mali, particularly where these Russian mercenary forces are believed to be active, there are very real questions also about abuses against civilians, some of which have already been reportedly committed. There have been several fairly credible reports now of abuses against civilians, either committed with the presence of Russian personnel or committed likely because of these offensive military operations that the Malian government is undertaking right now. And so, again, it's too early to say right now, but there are very real risks, not just in terms of stabilization programming and economic development, but also very real risks to civilians, and also a risk that that this continued short-term decision-making from the transitional government in Mali or from the military leadership will also have a series of follow-on effects, including even potentially a disruption to the peace process in northern Mali and a return to some sort of armed rebellion that goes beyond just the fight against jihadist groups. And already there are so many diverse armed actors in Mali, jihadist groups, armed groups that are part of the peace process, but also a series of local and communal militias that all have an impact on the security situation there. And so all of this could be, even though the situation is certainly not good right now, and has not been good for some time, there are very real risks in different parts of the country to sort of further and rapid degradation of the situation.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate your deep thoughts around the civilians and the development issues, and I would like to continue here with Bakary. The aspects of the Russian involvement related to development. We know that the Sahel, and particularly Mali, is facing with many challenges on climate, unemployment for young people who join the jihadists because there's nothing else to do. The role of women is important. The problems of local governance, you know, beyond the military aspects. Our center just released an important report with our partner Policy Center for the New South, highlighting these aspects. I would like to ask you, focusing on maybe on Mali or other countries like Niger. I know that you have really interesting thoughts around Niger. Is it possible for the Russians to play a role beyond the military aspects? I mean, on the development issues, do they have the means of their policy, Russians, of their policy in the Sahel? We know, I mentioned when I was talking about the history between Africa and the Soviet Union, that they have tried, and even under Putin and Medvedev, to bring Russian business leaders to invest in Africa. They are interested in natural resources, but do they have, economically speaking, on the development aspect, the means of their policy or not? What do you think, Bakary? I know you have to leave there, so.
Okay, thank you, Rama, and I'm very glad to speak after Andrew Lebovich, who is a colleague of mine, and we work a long time together in Western Africa. Okay, I think that Russians are exploiting disappointment. The people here in the region were promised economic development that would be ideally follow strict adherence to the guidelines of structural adjustment policies and privatization of the economy, which are essential for foreign investment. We know what happened next. In the 18th and the 19th, when a regime in any African country violated the rule of the democratic game, it was exposed to financial sanction from international partners, especially Western one. Today, this fear has been completely dispelled by the availability of alternative funds, sometimes much larger, from countries that have less regard for transparency or governance or respect to human rights, such as those in the Middle East or Asia. Now, in our region, I think that the Russian are exploiting this, what the Western power have missed. It is the question. They are welcoming the Russian, like some people who will save Mali, because they are disappointed from French policies, from the Western countries, and this kind of European diplomacy, which has neglected really the real society. And now I think that it will be very difficult because today there are also this disinformation operation that attempt to discredit French policy in the Sahel. At the same time, we see that we are in a new asymmetric war of influence. The issue is how will the democracies combat the strategy of a new partner of the Sahelian countries that does not care about ethics and principle framing fundamental freedom, democracy, and human rights. A real challenge now for the Western and democracies and their like-minded allies remain the conquest of the hearts. And to win this new battle, which will not be easy, a new deal will be needed beyond shared frustration and admitted resentments. But above all, it will be necessary to regain mutual trust while facing these new winds unfavorable to democracy, that such as political and religious populism and identity-based strategies in both the North and in the South. And I think that in Mali, we need some years in order to regain the trust of the population, and also the new authorities are exploiting also this frustration with some populism. And I think that it will be very difficult for the democracies to convince this population in the Sahel that they are better than the Russians. I'm sure the people will be disappointed in some weeks or some months regarding what's happening now in Central African republics. But I know that I think that this battle will be very difficult for the democracies, and you cannot use the same strategy like the Russian one, and who have also to convince people that democracy is either better than authoritarianism, and but it will be very, very difficult for them, because people now in the authorities, the new authorities are using populism, and they are exploiting the frustration and also the failures of the military and security policies in the region.
Thank you, Cameron. Can you allow me just one very quick question to Bakary before he leaves? I would like to I listened what you said very, very well, but what do you think about the last statement from coming from Imam Dicko in Mali, saying that we should not forget that our strategic partner should be France and should remain France? How do you, because this voice is very influent in Mali, how do you analyze this last statement, very recent?
Yes, I was with Imam Dicko in the same place in Nouakchott, where the French journalist Pascal Hérault have asked this question about the French military cooperation. Yes, Imam Dicko now have some problem with the military, you know, and now they are the military are more close to to Aydara, not Aydara, but the sheriff of the Nyoro, who is now the very influential man, because they do not agree with the Imam Dicko, who sometimes contests the legitimacy of the Prime Minister Choguel Maïga. Now you have some difficulties, some problem between Imam Dicko and the military in power. But I think that it is true, beyond populism, beyond this propaganda, the Malian society, civil society, is trying to contest the military, but there is a kind of dictatorship in the country now. The first intellectual who tried to contest or to criticize the military is to be jailed, like this professor from the Bamako University. The situation is very difficult for the civil society, and in the meantime, the European and the Western power are trying to leave Mali in a very difficult situation, while the Russians are implementing a very huge strategy of disinformation and propaganda through the region and through Mali especially.
Thank you, Bakary. Sean, I want to turn back to you, and maybe take a step outside of Mali, take a step back. We know that Wagner Group has had a lot of involvement across the continent in the past few years. Obviously, a lot of attention has been focused on the Central African Republic, where they've had probably the most extensive relationship, where they went in essentially, with the UN allowing them to go in, but having that mission kind of morph over time. Can you help us understand kind of what lessons they're learning as they expand their operations and they diversify their operations? They look very different in a place like Madagascar or Libya than they do in Central African Republic or Sudan. And so I'm curious, what can we expect of the Wagner Group now in Mali based upon the experiences that they've had, over the past few years operating in a diverse range of political and security environments?
Sure. Let me show you something that will answer that. If I can screen share for 1 second, it would help. Otherwise, I can talk it through. All right. Well, Wagner Group has, if you imagine the continent of Africa, Russia with the Wagner Group has sort of carved a spine up through the middle of it, from Madagascar, Mozambique, through CAR, Mali to Libya. Russia is making a play for what they perceive as a vacuum of great power leadership, or whatever you want to call it, in Africa to seek new partners and allies, etc. But they're not doing it the way that the EU, the UN has done it. These are not, nation building forces, as we saw in Syria, right? They went into Syria and they basically killed ISIS. They're strictly mercenary in that way. Now, something to think about is that Wagner Group is owned by Prigozhin. And Prigozhin is an oligarch who's close to Putin. And he has an umbrella company under him called Concord. Under Concord is the Wagner Group, the Internet Research Agency, which is the troll factory in St. Petersburg that does disinformation in American elections, EU elections, and in Africa, and an oil and gas company called Evropolis. They're a mining company. And one of the ways that somebody asked the question is, who pays Wagner? One of the business models, and it's an old one, is that, you go into business with your client. So Wagner is, there's going to get mining concessions from the current government that another company, Russian company that works for Prigozhin, can exploit. And it's going to be done with the disinformation of the troll factory, the mercenaries of Wagner Group, and Evropolis, this mining company. And what they've learned from Mozambique to CAR to Libya is that fighting wars and conflicts in Africa is a lot more complex than the Middle East. So, in Ukraine, Wagner, was very effective. In the Middle East, they were effective for what Russia wanted to do, which is swing the war away from the West towards a Russian, Iranian, Syrian axis. But when they went to Mozambique, Libya, and they started running into challenges. And then in the CAR, the UN lodged complaints of human rights abuse, rapes, and so forth. And what we can learn is that any country that gets in bed with the Wagner Group usually becomes less secure, not more secure. And I think, no, I don't think that's in the mind of the current administration in Mali. And let's look at what they're hiring Wagner to do. They're hiring Wagner to do really two things. One is, training and equipping their security forces, so professionalizing select elements of that force. And two is close protection, which is sort of like very fancy bodyguarding. But what they're really doing is they want regime security. I would argue they're not looking for national security. They're using the Wagner Group for regime security. And that will come with Wagner shooters, disinformation, and they will have to pay the price of mining concessions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. I would like to come back to Katrina to ask a question, because you mentioned earlier the different moves of the mercenaries, to speak like Sean, in the Sahel. Have you noticed movements on the coastal states? You see what I mean? It's the Sahel conflict has reached the Gulf of Guinea, with many coastal African countries who are under attack, targeting attacks that clearly indicate that the Atlantic coast is not far from the Sahel, and the Atlantic is the maritime border with the American continent. And here we remember the March 2016 attack on Grand Bassam beach near Abidjan, the first in the country's history, which killed 19 people. The abduction of French tourists in Benin, the attack on the Kafolo barracks in 2020 in Côte d'Ivoire too, etc. This is a strong signal that that demonstrate that the jihadists have good knowledge of these areas, according to all the experts. Do you imagine that the Russian mercenaries could follow them on the coastal state and have a security strategy on this part of the African continent?
Thanks for that question, Rama. I think that it's complicated because, as Sean was just pointing out, the Russian PMCs coming into a country like Mali are really entrenched with the regime itself, kind of preserving the power of the junta and its interests rather than necessarily national interests. And they're also looking out for their own interests. In all of these cases where we're seeing Wagner Group or other Russian PMC deployments to sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very high priority placed on the gains that Russia is getting from the situation, whether it's simply ensuring the spread of Russian influence, whether it's continuing to exploit these mining concessions and access to natural resources, or whether it's securing basing rights and other power projection capabilities, such as they've pursued in Sudan, in pursuit of the naval base at Port Sudan. Russia has really, in a lot of cases, had the most success in furthering its own interests through the actions of the PMCs, rather than necessarily accomplishing the security goals of the host nation. And to some extent, that's also in their interest, right? If Wagner were to come in and completely resolve the security situation and the threat is over, then they're out of a job. So to some extent, the goal is to do their job just well enough to not get fired, as they were in Mozambique, but they don't want to actually bring about such stability that there's no longer a reason for them there and there's no longer a dependence on that Russian assistance. So as we think about kind of the spread of violence throughout the Sahel, the threat to coastal nations, we've seen definitely Russian overtures, including Russian PMC overtures to some of those countries, including exploiting political instability in places like Guinea. And as well as, of course, several of my fellow panelists have talked about Sochi and the broader Russian outreach diplomatically to sub-Saharan African nations for security cooperation and other diplomatic deals. So certainly, I think they are open to exploiting those situations for just a furtherance of this model, in the same way of providing these security services, providing training services in exchange for these other concessions. However, I would expect those to be individually negotiated deals with those countries if they're able to secure them. Often, when we're talking about PMC deployments on the back of other security cooperation deals between the formal Russian government and local governments, I would not expect to see them really chase jihadist groups across borders and really be pursuing this kind of cross-region effort to eliminate the Islamist threat in the Sahel, because at the end of the day, I don't think that's what their goal is in coming in here. Their goal is to accomplish the Russian economic and geopolitical goals that the private military companies are able to further. And it is to carry out the wishes of the junta, which at this point are primarily based around their own security and, as I mentioned before, really coup-proofing them. At this point in time, they and the Wagner Group are able to exploit longstanding resentment against the French, both dating back to the colonial era and perceptions of neocolonialism, as well as controversy, depending on what region you're in, around the success of Barkhane over the past decade. But there's also a lot of discontent against the military junta following their takeover. And I think particularly as we see local security conditions continue to dissolve with the exit of French and other European forces, and added on not only questionable competence of the Wagner group, but also atrocities committed by Wagner itself against local populations. I think we're going to continue to see the junta fall in popularity and really rely on looking at a centralized mission of the Wagner group being preserving their own security, rather than potentially expanding beyond borders for a broader regional goal.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm going to jump in and have a question for Michael, kind of borrowing on some of what Katrina just was discussing, and ask you, Michael, if you can help us make sense of some of the kind of the regional dynamics here, and how, I mean, obviously we've spent most of our time talking about Mali, but the situation in Burkina is highly unstable. Niger is faltering. Chad, across the region, you have weak institutions and weak governments. And of course, ECOWAS as a regional institution has had, I think, very mixed responses to all of these coups and political instability. How do you see the region responding to this new introduction of the Wagner Group? Number one, and secondly, how much can we? How much should we be attributing a kind of growing anti-French sentiment across the region to some of these inroads that are being made? Is there a correlative relationship or a causal relationship that we should be viewing here?
Well, this question of correlative and causative, I think, is very important, because it leads to the question of understanding the extent to which Wagner is responsible, Russia is responsible, versus France being responsible. I mean, we all agree that Wagner has some responsibility, Russia has some responsibility. But again, the fact that they're able to achieve so much depends a large part on the fact that there's already this predisposition to believe what Wagner has come to sell, the anti-French sentiment. I think if we look at the region, I think that at least both in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in Niger, what we see evidence of is a kind of a cognitive dissonance between sort of the idea that the French and the EU and the UN have been busy fighting in the US and Africa, they've been fighting terrorists for all these years, and the reality that nothing's going well at all. Everything's getting really bad, particularly in Burkina Faso, which is really just kind of unraveling as we speak here. So how do we understand this? And in this inability to come to terms with how to understand this, I think a lot of people are really very inclined to sort of turn to ideologies or conspiracy theories or whatever. And of course, the Russians are there present to try to feed these, ideas and to try to sort of help sort of the mob, if you will, along certain lines of ways of thinking. Along with that is, and so for Burkina Faso, Niger, then part of the problem is that they also have to come to terms with this populism, these populist attitudes that are strong. They have to figure out how to work with the French in a way that's productive. They have to weigh all sorts of political pressures in order to stick around, to stay in power. And so I think that the Burkinabe and the Nigerian leadership are going to be thinking really hard about how to do this. I've seen no evidence that the Burkinabe or the Nigerian leadership want to stop working with France. I think that's far from the case. And along with that is, I don't think that they're really interested in working with Wagner either. But at the same time, they have to figure out, well, how are they actually going to do this? ECOWAS is a whole other wrinkle, because ECOWAS is such a sort of a complex mess of kind of contradictions and inconsistencies. And so I think that's a harder thing. But I think my understanding is that I think people tend to think of ECOWAS as sort of like it's an adjunct of French foreign policy. It's sort of part of the Western campaign against the Sahelian countries. And I think that they're eager to lap up Russian propaganda to that effect. One thing that I really want to make clear, and I realize the glare from my glasses is terrible. One thing I want to make clear is that in Mali in particular, there's this real desire to find a shortcut to like an easy way to to deal with the country's problems. So instead of dealing with any of the massive problems that the country has, demographic, environmental, political, social, et cetera, or with security sector reform, I see the Malian government over the last 15, 20 years has been looking for shortcuts, for silver bullets that will somehow magically solve everything. And I think that in Mali, they're really kind of grasping on Russian partnership as like, this is somehow the silver bullet, which is going to solve everything, which of course is ridiculous. Those currents of thought do exist in Niger and Burkina Faso as well. And I think only time will tell to see whether or not those currents become dominant the way they have become in Mali. And there, I think a lot of it's been, what's happened is because the junta has found it politically expedient to cater to those currents, to those discourses, whereas in Burkina Faso, Niger, we're not yet there, but we're gonna have to wait and see.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to come back to the jihadist groups in Africa. Since 1 hour now, we are speaking about Russia's role, how to deal with this tough situation in the Sahel. Like the same since more than 10 years now. From time to time, there is a voice requesting a dialogue with the jihadist groups themselves. And I'd like here to come back to Andrew and give him the floor about this tough issue. You remember a few months ago about Afghanistan, the dialogue with the Taliban has been raised as a solution, to struggle against the terrorist groups. In here, should it be the same in the Sahel? Do you think that we should speak with them? Could this dialogue be a solution to get out from this war that has been lasting now since more than 10 years? Andrew?
Well, thank you. And certainly, as you pointed out, this is a question that a lot of people are asking and have been asking for some time in Mali on a governmental civil society level, and even among religious leaders, famously, of course, Imam Diko, who you mentioned earlier. I think the first thing is to say that this is obviously a question for Sahelian populations and Sahelian governments to decide. And this is where I think the international community has sometimes made a mistake in trying to set red lines that are really not on questions that are for them to decide. The other question when it comes to negotiations with jihadist groups is not necessarily, oftentimes the question is posed, can we talk to jihadist groups? And the question is not can you, it's what is the actual benefit? And so here I think the challenge is that the stipulations that jihadist groups have placed often on discussion have in the past been so high that governments really wouldn't be able to meet them before even opening discussions. And there have been informal talks over the years, but they haven't really led to very much. Because I think at the end of the day, oftentimes, even in terms of local peace arrangements in Mali and Burkina Faso, and even other parts of the region, they've often fallen apart precisely because the underlying political and military situation hasn't changed much. They've been largely short-term arrangements that oftentimes have been really to the benefit of the jihadist groups. So, if these, to the question of whether or not these talks could lead to a sort of political solution, it really would depend on what you think the jihadist groups want ultimately. And then also whether or not governments and populations can accept this. And I think generally it's important to maintain channels of dialogue. It's important to have this kind of dialogue, if only to better assess privately and also publicly what jihadist groups want, what kind of conditions they would put in place as part of some sort of a negotiated solution. But I don't think that this would be the answer to the conflict, to the various conflicts in the Sahel, in part because the goals of these groups still remain very diametrically opposed to what regional governments, the international community, and also what many local populations would accept. And it's actually, it's interesting because sometimes when talking to people in the region or looking at social media, you do hear people say, well, the US talked to the Taliban in Afghanistan, so why can't we talk to jihadist groups here? Which is a fair question, but then But we should also, of course, look at what happened subsequently in Afghanistan.
It's a great point, Andrew, and one that I want to pick up on the last part of that, which we haven't talked much about, which is the U.S. role in all of this. Obviously, we tend to frame Mali and the Sahel, and you hear even U.S. officials, at least privately, talking about it as a French problem, or the French having more skin in the game. But certainly, U.S. has been a key enabler of French involvement in Mali for some time. And so, I want to ask a kind of a two-part question for both Sean and Katrina. With respect to the U.S. role, both in Mali and how the U.S. policy to Mali is being framed, do we need to be looking beyond the French role, which I don't think we have been up until now? And if and when we do, what should that be looking like? And then subsequently to that, with respect to Wagner's participation in this conflict and inside of Mali right now, what can the United States be doing to either limit their expansion there or to try to roll it back? We've seen sanctions imposed on Wagner abuses in Central African Republic late last year. So there have been some sanctions, but it seems pretty modest. Is there anything more that the U.S. can be doing to kind of roll back this involvement from Wagner in the country before it really takes on an even more sort of pernicious element? So maybe Katrina, to you, and then to Sean.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I think that one of the big challenges here, as you noted, the United States has played a very important enabling role for French action in Mali. One of the big concerns here is that the US is also signaling that its priorities are shifting, that there's an interest in getting a lighter footprint in the region, and also just more broadly in terms of our national security strategy since the NDS in 2018. There's this shift away from prioritizing counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. And so, especially as the situation in Mali gets more complex, and especially as French and European partners look to withdraw, potentially focusing on neighboring countries, I don't know that the United States really has the political will at this point to ramp up operations to continue to support that in an extended way. I think the other complicating factor here, and this starts to get into the second part of the question really on what the US can do to counter private military companies like Wagner, is that at this point in time, there is not a clear centralized hub in the United States federal government for tracking, monitoring, and responding to Russian private military companies such as the Wagner Group. This is something that's being tracked somewhat disparately across different federal agencies. There's no clear data collection. There's no single unifying strategy for how we disrupt these operations, despite the fact that they're a major enabling factor for Russia operations, and much of broader great power competition is likely to come through irregular means such as this. So even though you might think, as the United States moves away from counterterrorism, moves away from counterinsurgency, we're still interested in stepping in here to disrupt something that's enabling Russian influence to grow, we really don't currently have the infrastructure in place in the government to mount a concentrated response to Wagner. And so even just starting to build that up in the interagency, I think, is one huge priority. The other big things that I think we should be looking at, in addition to sanctions, as you mentioned, disrupting some of these financial networks, and especially insofar as these different shell companies are really networked across different deployments, I think that transparency is very important. Some of that is making clear to host countries what the true price tag is of bringing in Russian private military companies, making clear that even if they give you a low monthly rate and you're expending low amounts of money, you're still paying the price insofar as they're often less experienced, less well qualified for the task, and less successful than others could be in intervening. They also bring a heavy price in terms of human rights abuses, as we've seen in locations like the CAR. There are also another approach there around those abuses would be legal prosecution in addition to sanctions as punishment, either looking at violations of international law or local law. And then the last thing I would just touch on is that one of the biggest challenges, I think, for the United States, for France, for all of these Western nations who are now responding to the spread of Russian influence in nations like Mali, nations across sub-Saharan Africa where Russian PMCs have been deployed, is that the Russian narrative here, and several of my co-panelists have talked a lot about the issue of disinformation and propaganda. The Russian narrative in that propaganda really focuses on the US and France and other Western nations coming in with a colonial mindset and really using African nations as set pieces in broader geopolitical battles against Russia in these grand ideological competitions rather than prioritizing local needs. And then when the United States or other nations step in as soon as the Russian private military companies arrive in country and say, oh no, we don't want this Russian influence here. Let's look at a way of ramping up and countering the Russian private military companies who are coming in to ostensibly serve your local needs. That's really just, in a lot of ways, validating the Russian narrative. And so I think a lot of the ways that you need to counter this urge to turn to Russian private military companies, to turn to the Kremlin, is to engage in a more genuine way with the actual needs of African states. And so that is getting at a lot of the root causes of instability, really engaging with the political sector, with civil society actors in these countries to build up more resilience to violence, and really listening to the needs of partners and really having a multi-sector campaign in addressing local violence and in building good governance techniques, rather than only coming in with this message of serving US or Western interests in order to counter Russia.
Thank you, Katrina. Speaking of global powers and their role, there's the United States, of course. And there is another actor we have not mentioned so much, but that is important, a key player on the African continent now and a partner of Russia. China. China may observe these moves from its ideological partner on the international stage. I don't know how. I'd like to ask our friends Michael and Andrew, or one of them, what they think about this link, this bound between Russia and China on the African continent. Is there a link, a geopolitical link, move together on the African continent? Do they share the same interests? How long could it last? These joint, views, and is this the first step of a new geopolitical order? Because maybe you will see a link between what's going on in Bamako and compare with what's going on in Kiev. But from Kiev to Bamako, is there something similar here? A new geopolitical order? What's your thought about this?
If I may, I don't really see much of a link between what Russia's doing and what China's doing, other than that both of them, I believe, have an interest in disrupting the established order. They have an interest in disrupting the French influence and American influence. I think that's to their advantage. But other than that, I don't see much evidence of any kind of coordination or really anything like that. I think there is a link with Ukraine, although it's kind of thin, but it does have to do with the fact that Russia and France do butt heads. They butt heads in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're clearly butting heads now in Ukraine. And I do think that one of the possible motives for Russia in Mali, and I say possible because I don't think any of us really knows, is that France with Takuba and with the EU, EUTM, UCAP, to some extent has been using Mali as an opportunity to try to give shape to its own vision of European security policy by basically rallying a bunch of EU countries together behind their lead, right behind their flag, and an effort to move forward and to do this, because this is very much a French geopolitical project. And what Russia is doing is basically undermining this project and frustrating it. Now, I can't pretend or can't imagine that this is a high priority for the Russian government, but it's certainly, at the very least, it's sort of icing on the cake. This is something France wants. It's also no accident that a lot of the Takuba partners involved with France are countries that look to France for some sort of protection, or they want to work with France and they want to buy into this French European security project. You also have, unsurprisingly, you've got all the Nordic countries involved, or a lot of the Nordic countries involved, again, because they sort of buy this idea that they're small, they're weak. They want to make friends with the most powerful country in the European Union, which is France. So they're all on board. And here we have Russia messing with that. So that's a connection there. But other than that, I really don't see much in terms of what they're doing with China. For one thing, because Chinese motivations tend to be really much more mercantile, much more sort of colonialist in the classical sense. Russia, really not so much. And sometimes for kicks, I think what might be fun is to try to foster conspiracy theory about the fact that the mining sector in Mali is dominated by Canadians. So maybe they're the real power at play here, and there's going to be this new geopolitical reordering that's going to be, the strings are going to be pulled out of Ottawa. I'm kidding, but I think that my kind of silly idea sort of points to the fact that mercantile interests and economic activities do not necessarily bespeak any kind of larger geopolitical project.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think now we have taken the best of all of you. We hopefully, it's my case, we understand much more what's going on. We have still a few questions about Russia's role, because Russia has not said everything about itself on the African continent. So stay tuned. It's something that is going on right now. Maybe the summit of Brussels will open new doors. We'll see what French will do about their military involvement in Mali and beyond Mali, the Sahel. But I would like to thank you, all of you, for your thoughts, comments, very helpful, very smart. I'm sure Cameron and all the centers who are represented here from the Europe to the Africa and Eurasia centers have appreciated your thoughts and comments. Thank you for our audience for participating. At some point we were more than 140 people. It's a lot for an all virtual event. So thank you for the viewers. I'm sure it's because of the passion and expertise you put in this conversation, our guest today. So thank you very much. If you want to, read more about the Sahel, I would like to remind you to visit our website, where you will find our last report on the Sahel, written with our partner from Morocco, the Policy Center for the New South. And it is very, very interesting. We will next see each other around our Sahel development program. We'll roll out this program during a conference series, an event every 2 months in the next month. So happy to see you again. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you, our guest, for your expertise, and you helped us a lot to understand more what's going on in the Sahel around Russia. Thank you very much, and have a good end of day. Thank you. Bye-bye.